Hello, welcome to Image Bearers. My name is Toma Edgy. I'm very, very excited for today's episode. I have been conversing on and off with Miss Du Mez, and she has been able to make some time in her schedule to join the podcast today. As you probably have seen, she is everywhere, and we will talk about that a little bit today on this episode. So again, welcome, Miss Du Mez. I know that you again are going to be sharing about your book, Jesus and John Wayne, and I think you have a copy. Can you share?
I do. Yes. Out in paperback on Tuesday.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So assisting with the program today, we also have some co-hosts, Dr. Douglas Jacoby, who's actually joining us from Scotland, Edinburgh. We have Sheila Gregoire, who's in Canada. We have Becky Castle-Miller also joining us, and my good friend, Sherry Simpson. So let's go ahead and start it out. I will go with the first three questions. So, Ms. Du Mez, why did you decide to write Jesus and John Wayne?
Okay, but we talked about this. So you have to call me Kristin from here on out. But yeah, and thank you for hosting this. Thank you for this conversation. It's great to be here virtually in the same space with you all. I really appreciate it. So how did I come to write Jesus and John Wayne? It started a long time ago, the idea for it. I never intended at the time to call it Jesus and John Wayne. That came later, but it was more than 15 years ago that it was my students at Calvin University who introduced me to the literature on evangelical masculinity at that time. They told me I needed to read John Eldredge's book, Wild at Heart. And so I did. And I was kind of shocked by what I read, to be honest. It was shocking. In part because, I had expected a lot more of kind of biblical interpretation in a book that was setting up an ideal of Christian masculinity, and there wasn't much there. Instead, he looked to Hollywood heroes, and Mel Gibson's William Wallace was his favorite. And it was a very militant conception of Christian masculinity, right? God is a warrior God. Men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. And so it was at that time I started looking into this more. I discovered there were dozens of books like this. This was around 2005 or 2006. I also paid attention to what else was going on. And there's a lot of survey data coming out showing how white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support the Iraq War at the time, preemptive war, condone the use of torture, embrace aggressive foreign policy. And so I just asked, what does one have to do with the other? And then I set it aside, all the research aside for a decade, in part because it wasn't clear to me how mainstream all of this was. Even though I knew the sales figures, I was hearing about this everywhere. It just felt so extreme. It felt fringe, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And so it wasn't until the fall of 2016 that a series of events led me to realize that it was much more mainstream than I realized, this militant conception of Christian masculinity. And that's when I decided that I needed to dust off that old research and write this book.
Well, I'm glad the research didn't have that much dust and you were able to pick it up and get it going, because it's just a very powerful book, along with other books that have been written to really just paint a picture that is just undeniable. Mm-hmm. So in your book, you also assert that today's evangelicalism can be more accurately defined as a cultural and political movement. This movement is defined by what one consumes and not primarily by the scriptures. Can you please break that down a little bit?
Yeah, so there are different ways to define evangelicalism, and I don't claim to have the only way. In fact, I push back against the idea that there is one way to define it, and because then who gets to decide, right? So evangelical leaders often like to define evangelicalism according to theology. So it's this kind of rubric of theological beliefs and the authority of the scriptures and crucicentrism, or the centrality of the cross, and conversionism, the born again experience, and then evangelism or activism. So you act out of your faith. And what I find is, as a cultural historian, it's actually more useful to study evangelicalism as a historical and cultural movement. And so I give a lot more attention to people who self-identify as evangelicals, that there's something important going on there. Because if you use this theological rubric, what you find is that many Christians globally and in America can check those boxes. In America, for example, the majority of Black Protestants can check those theological boxes. But we know that the majority of Black Protestants who can check those boxes do not identify as evangelical, right? And so that's a clue that there's more to evangelicalism than simply this kind of theological rubric. And so what is it? We have to look at, where people attend church, and we have a lot of segregation there in terms of, geographic segregation and religious segregation. But we also see that what Black Protestants mean by some of these boxes, right? The authority of the scriptures. Which Bible verses are they pointing to as kind of a guide to faith in life? Not always the same as white evangelicals. Who is Christ to them, really? So what does it mean to follow that Christ? What does activism or faith-based activism look like? So there are these pretty important differences when you look at lived experience. And so what I came to understand is that we need to understand evangelicalism as lived experience, as a network, or series of networks, alliances, and in many ways as a consumer culture. So to be evangelical today means that you have been immersed to greater or lesser degrees in an evangelical consumer culture, right? You've listened to James Dobson's Focus on the Family radio growing up. You've read Christian books. You shop at Christian bookstores. You listen to Christian radio, Christian music. And so I'm not talking about who's a real evangelical and who's a fake evangelical or not real evangelical. I prefer to say, how much have individuals been immersed in this evangelical culture? How much has this shaped them? And for some people, it's they dip a toe in here or there. For others, it's full immersion. And so that's how I'm treating evangelicalism. It's not a snappy answer, but I think it's truer to lived experience and to understanding that evangelicalism is not just a theology. Theology is part, but it's very much a historical and cultural movement today.
Yeah, and I think with that, one of the things I think about is the news programs that are consumed that dictate one's beliefs.
Yes.
We won't go down that rabbit hole too much, but I think that's something for consideration.
Absolutely.
Okay. What did you find most shocking and perhaps surprising in your research? I know you mentioned you dusted off your notes and you kind of started back at it, but what are some of the things that perhaps were most surprising in your research?
So a couple of things. One, to be honest, the teachings on sexuality, and here Sheila is the expert, and she knows exactly what I'm talking about. We wrote our books in tandem, didn't really know about the other, and we end up quoting some of the very same horrifying passages from some of these sex manuals from the 1960s and 1970s. Teachings on sexuality that really do set women up for abuse. That make it very difficult for women to identify abuse, for members of communities to call out abuse. And honestly, I found that shocking to see it just so plainly. You didn't need a lot of interpretation to see where this gets you. It's just, it's staring you right in the face. That, and I have to say, when I went back and looked at evangelical writings from the 1960s and 1970s, I was not prepared for how much authority was a theme. The authority of men over women, clearly the authority of parents over children, this kind of just hierarchy to chain of command, if you will. And what I saw when I was reading it is it just struck me as frankly authoritarian and anti-democratic. And now this was years ago that I was first looking at this, right? I was like, what do I do with this? This is what I'm seeing. This can't be. This isn't right. And then subsequent events have led me to engage that much more seriously. The authoritarian leanings of some of much of the teachings on how evangelicals understand the God-ordained social order.
Wow. We got to keep moving. Thank you for that. We're going to move on to Mr. Douglas. Got some questions.
Thank you. Kristin, as I mentioned before, I really loved your book
Thank
a
you.
lot. And it's a great title, and the title is justified. And the subtitle is, wow, the subtitle packs a punch. So the subtitle, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Now, America's still there, and Christianity is not in multiple parts anymore, or is it? Maybe some points on how white evangelical theology has had that impact on nation and church. And this is you were addressing that in the previous question, so
Yeah.
maybe there's something else.
Oh, yeah. So the subtitle, yes. It took us about 3 months to come up with this, and we were running out of time. I've always thought of this as my book on white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And then we heard from the sales team of my publisher that the words masculinity and militarism were both too long to include in a subtitle or title. So back to the drawing boards. So what that meant is we had Jesus and John Wayne. We were good with that. And then we really had to think, what ultimately is this book about? And this is what we came down to. The first part, corrupted of faith, that I need to stress is not a historical claim. It's not. It's Christianity is what it is, right? It is whatever we see. That's is that a corruption? No, we're just we're describing. That's my little theological insertion, and it's really taking the opportunity to speak to evangelicals directly on their own terms, self-proclaimed Bible-believing evangelicals. What I do in this book is I show how time and again, fairly straightforward biblical teachings are set aside, for all their claims of, biblical literalism and the authority of the scriptures, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And these are explicitly rejected. Like, no, that doesn't apply to this moment. No. And that's not, you're not going to raise boys to be strong men by teaching them to turn the other cheek. No. Right. And so that's, and we could talk about, historical doctrines of the Trinity, for example, playing fast and loose with those in order to support patriarchy and things like that. So that's just my little, much of this book is, it's written for anybody, not for evangelicals in particular, but that subtitle is addressing evangelicals in particular, as I do a little bit in the intro and the conclusion to the book. And then the fractured a nation part, that's my insistence that this book does matter, even if you're not an evangelical, even if you don't care about evangelicals. It matters for American democracy. It matters for the state of our nation. America is in a perhaps uniquely polarized time. I shouldn't say unique. We're in a polarized moment. We've had some polarized moments before, but we are in one. And what I have seen through this research is how evangelicals, conservative white evangelicals, have really fostered and sustained this us versus them mentality, right? We are the faithful remnant, and the threats are external in terms of foreign policy, communism, radical Islam, but they're also internal. Feminists, liberals, secular humanists, right? Democrats, if you will. Like you can just see this as the book goes on, and so that has contributed to a fractured political landscape where the ends will justify the means because God is on our side, right? And if God is on our side, then our opponents are our enemies and they're God's enemies. So why would you want to compromise? Why would you want to make sure that they have the vote? And so, one way to think about it is if conservative white evangelicals were motivated over the last half century by other Bible verses, say, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies, turn the other cheek, what would that look like in terms of the American political landscape? And so that's the fractured a nation part.
Yeah, what you're sharing seems very fair to me. Evangelicals, usually we say, okay, you believe Jesus, the Son of God, the Bible's the Word of God, and you need to become a child of God. But there are other things that, I don't, sometimes I call myself an evangelical, sometimes not. It just depends.
Yeah.
My other question, do you see many parallels between this resistance, white evangelical resistance to civil rights movement and other movements in our own time? Do you want to share a thought or two about that?
Yeah, you can, looking at, in the book, I sketch out the various white evangelical responses to the civil rights movement, and it's complicated. It's there's an array of responses. There's outright resistance, particularly among Southern evangelicals, particularly in the 1950s and into the 1960s. Then you've got folks like Billy Graham, who kind of are walking the line and up to a point supporting civil rights, but only up to a point. And he's kind of representative for, I think, the majority of white evangelicals by the end of the 60s of, okay, you have the Civil Rights Act, you have the Voting Rights Act, that's enough, we're good now. And so as far as consistency, I think I see a lot of parallels around the issue of race and perhaps around other issues as well, but just looking at race, the idea that, white evangelicals are convinced that they are not racist. They are reluctant to listen to the voices who are not white, who are telling them that there's some room for improvement, right? Very resistant, just like Billy Graham was resistant to really listening to the voices of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and really being attentive to what equality looks like, what civil rights look like, how important economic equality, economic opportunities are, this broader spectrum, understanding the situation of African Americans in American cities, understanding protests, things like that. I think we see a lot of parallels today of white evangelicals who, like the more moderate evangelicals in the 1960s and 1970s, are not going to be saying most are not going to be saying explicitly racist things, but they will be embracing things like, pro-law enforcement and anti-Black Lives Matter. Just like, generations earlier embraced law and order politics, claiming that this is not racist. Law and order, good things. But in the historical context, right, we need to understand that this was, infused with racial dynamics. We see many of the same patterns today in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And yet this real disconnect, I think, when white evangelicals are engaged on the issue of race, because race is not often visible within white evangelical conversations, right? They kind of this color blindness, and they are convinced that their narrative is that they were on the right side of the civil rights movement, and they'll point to Billy Graham taking down those barriers between the sections of his audience, and so really feel innocent and therefore are deeply offended when they are accused of kind of being on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of this issue. So I think we can learn a lot by looking at white evangelical engagement with race over the last really 3/4 of a century.
Thank you very much. Very helpful.
There have been a number of books that have come out recently, and I've seen people on Twitter call this the Jesus and John Wayne bundle.
Oh.
So there's and Amazon will put these books together too. So books like A Church Called Tove, The Color of Compromise, Stamped from the Beginning, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, Sheila's The Great Sex Rescue, Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. So people are reading these books in tandem with Jesus and John Wayne. How do you feel that sort of book bundle is being received by the evangelical church?
Yeah, it's been so much fun, really, to release a book that is immediately in conversation with so many other amazing books. It is a moment. It does feel like a moment. My first book, published in 2015, it's a book on the history of Christian feminism. I thought it was good. I thought it was important. And I thought it was kind of unlike anything that had been written before. And I thought that was a selling point. And then I realized that it's actually much better to have a book that is in conversation with other books, it's just better for all of us. And so I learned that with the publication of Jesus and John Wayne, that I think, many of us have, were responding, like I did in the fall of 2016, saying, I know something here. I have something to bring into this conversation. And as, the months and the years went by, experiencing what was going on politically, religiously during the Trump administration, I think, again, many of us felt urgency to bring what we could, what we knew into this conversation. And so right now, I think it's a it's a remarkable time. Not just are our books out there, but they're out there in a moment where so many of us are connected to each other on social media, right? As writers and as readers. And that has really changed the playing field, I think, because, when I published Jesus and John Wayne, I was known in religious historian circles, but not much beyond that. And now we've all kind of found each other. And so our readers find us, and then they tell their friends, and then we're connected, and our readers find, each other's books. And it does change the power dynamics. In Jesus and John Wayne, I write a lot about this, evangelical popular culture, this consumer culture. I write about gatekeepers. And I think what's happening right now is because of social media and because of the kind of activism on social media of just ordinary readers, evangelicals, former evangelicals, and the like, we're changing those power dynamics. And so we're able to reach new audiences, and it does feel like a moment. Now, I will say, there are also echo chambers, right? And so people who like us find us, and then a few people who really don't like us will also find us, but the vast majority, right, are fans. And so that can give a slightly warped perspective. I think it's a little self-selective that, the people who don't like these books are ignoring them. The vast majority, right? There'll be a couple critical reviews. There'll be some, comments on Facebook or on Twitter every once in a while. But so within evangelicalism, I don't know, it's kind of hard to say. The enthusiasm is absolutely there. The numbers are there. I don't have a great sense of, exactly the breakdown. Are we talking 80-20 kind of 20% loving this and 80% ignoring or really disliking us? Maybe, I keep going back to the infamous 81% in the election of 2016. And honestly, that kind of feels about like what we're looking at. The 20% is not insignificant. They're becoming increasingly vocal. And I think one of the most empowering things happening is that they're finding each other, right? So many people who felt alienated, who felt, they didn't know what to do. They felt trapped. They, didn't feel like they could speak out. They are speaking out, and they're watching other people speak out. And some are leaving their churches. Some are being forced out of their churches. Some are losing jobs. The experience is incredibly fraught in many cases. I hear these stories, poignant stories. But what we have is that they find each other. And so, communities are formed, virtual book clubs, and real friendships and real support networks develop out of social media connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in a Jesus and John Wayne book club right now, and we appreciate it so much that you joined us just a few weeks ago. So I'm seeing so many of my friends being in book clubs discussing these books and building those friendships around talking about these ideas. So this kind of American subculture formed in the 1940s and 50s around ideas of keeping America Christian, keeping America safe, keeping American families strong. And it was like this confluence of nationalism, militarism, patriarchy, gender traditionalism, etc. How specifically do you think that masculine power was used to try and accomplish those objectives?
Yeah, you're right. So the late 40s, early 50s, especially, this is the early Cold War era. And all of these things that you just listed fit together so neatly, right? Because the threat is communism. And communism is seen as anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American. And it's a military threat, right? Legit. It is. And so evangelicals feel like they have a special role to protect Christianity. They see themselves as the most faithful remnant, right, over against liberal Protestants and progressives and mainline, and then they see themselves as therefore having an important role to play in protecting Christian America as well. And gender traditionalism is part of the package, right? Not for all evangelicals, I want to stress. I mean, my first book was on evangelical feminism in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's important to keep in mind that, patriarchy and evangelicalism are not inevitable. And you can find expressions of evangelical feminism throughout American history as well. But conservative evangelicals in the 1940s 1940s coalesced around patriarchal gender roles and understood that to be kind of God's will for women and men, and also for an orderly society. And so all these things did fit together because they thought that God ordained men to be protectors and providers. And in the Cold War context, that role of protector was especially important. And so men needed to be strong. Again, this is not a metaphorical threat, it's a real threat. They needed to be strong to fight, to protect faith, family, and nation. Now, the thing is, in the 1940s, 1950s, that was not so different from the beliefs held by many Americans, right? This is the post-war baby boom, Leave It to Beaver era, Cold War consensus. And this was right at the time when evangelicals had wanted to reassert their influence. They felt marginalized after the fundamentalist modernist controversies. They had a plan in 1942 to form the National Association of Evangelicals and reassert their influence over the country. And they were able to do so quite well because their values aligned so well with many other Americans' values, especially of the white middle class, right? All that changed in the 1960s. Right, because then you have the civil rights movement challenging the status quo, particularly for Southern white evangelicals, and then you had feminism challenging "quote unquote" traditional gender roles, and you had the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement challenging Christian America, the idea that America was essentially great and good. And this is when evangelicals doubled down on those values, when many other Americans start to question them, right? You know, American goodness, American greatness, traditional gender roles that were really a reaction to rather, recent historical events. And that's when these values become oppositional values for white evangelicals, right? And they move to the center of their identity. And this is the era where we see the rise of the religious right too. So these values are expressed politically and culturally and religiously. And if you think about all of those challenges to the status quo, challenges to their understanding of how the world ought to be, the solution is the assertion of white patriarchal authority. In terms of civil rights, particularly questions of segregation and evangelical resistance to desegregation and the authority of parents over their children, meaning white parents over their children, feminism, and the Vietnam War. We need strong men to fight to defend America, and feminism is emasculating American men. The assertion of patriarchal authority, and specifically white patriarchal authority, was the solution to all of those. And that's how it moves to the center of evangelical identity, but this time over and against many other Americans.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hello, Kristin. I think it's my turn now.
Yes, good to see you again. We've done this before.
You too. Yes. In the Blue Parakeet, our friend Scott McKnight states that we all pick and choose what we follow in the Bible. So can you share what you believe the evangelical church has decided to follow or not follow in the scriptures, and how that has led us to where we are today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So conservative evangelicals in particular, have tended to really home in on verses that suggest gender difference, right? So on key texts about women's religious authority, on the role of women and the role of men. Now, if you look at the scriptures, there are actually only a tiny fraction of verses that address gender difference, if you will, like really, if you think about it. And then there are contested interpretations, biblical, and even kind of interpreted through a conservative hermeneutic. There are contested interpretations of every single one of those passages. And again, my first book was a history of feminist theology, and so I've studied those interpretations that were advanced not by liberal theologians or secular women, secular feminists, but by women who held firmly to the authority of the scriptures, who identified as fundamentalists and still brought a different reading to the scriptures. But I would say that conservative evangelicals love to emphasize gender difference at the expense of many, many passages of the scriptures that, as I understand it, are meant to apply to women and men alike. And here I'm talking about, for example, the Beatitudes. the fruit of the Spirit, right? If you just think about those for a minute, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. And then you look at how, this kind of militant Christian masculinity is described, like none of those fit. And again, the teachings of love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, this whole model of Christ as being so radical because he did not live into the expectations that people placed on what would a Messiah look like. And so, he turned these worldly expectations on their head and always about power, right? How to wield power or how to divest of power. And so I think that when I look at the passages that white evangelicals emphasize, I actually see a lot of what they are not emphasizing, right? What they are disregarding, what they are explaining away, and some pretty core teachings of Christ and pretty, traditional Christian virtues, which they have gendered. And so gentleness and love and self-control, those are feminine, and not just feminine, but effeminate if applied to men. And that's, again, this corruption of the faith that I'm talking about, right? We need to kind of take a few steps back here, try to, as much as possible, right, remove some of these cultural trappings, and it's you can never remove them all, right? We all bring our own lenses to the scriptures, but we can help each other identify some of these lenses a little bit better, try to peel those back, and then take a fresh look at the scriptures.
Amen. Yes, speaking of gentleness and men, you don't really think of John Wayne as gentle, which is probably why you chose him for the title. But for the younger generations, can you even explain who John Wayne is? Because a lot of us don't know, although I'm an older generation now, but for the younger ones.
Oh, you're Canadian, so forgiven. So yes, if I could have squeezed Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart into this title, I would have, because that's the kind of connector. But John Wayne works really well too, because it does root this story in history. And so John Wayne, for those of you who don't know, was an incredibly famous and beloved actor for since the 1940s, right? He really, really kind of rose to stardom in the late 40s in starring in Westerns. Right? He was this cowboy hero. And then he stars in World War II films like The Sands of Iwo Jima, where he takes this like Wild West heroism, this cowboy hero identity, and then brings it to the battlefields in the Second World War. And then he just stays enormously popular. And then he stars in films like, The Alamo, again, this kind of traditional hero, continues to star in Westerns. And then in the 1960s stars in The Green Berets. And this is the, or it's 70s. So it's the only movie about the Vietnam War that is favorable towards the Vietnam War that is produced by a major motion picture industry. So that presents the war in these heroic terms. So again, you kind of take that cowboy hero, turn him into World War II hero, and then you take that good war hero and then apply it to the battlefields in Vietnam. Now, one thing else I will say about John Wayne, in if you think about many of his most popular films, he is the hero who will resort to violence to achieve order and to pursue righteousness as he understands it. And in many of these cases I just listed, he is the white masculine hero who will use violence to subdue non-white populations, right? Native Americans, Japanese, Mexicans, the Vietnamese, right? You just kind of go through. And that was one of the things, again, I mentioned that white evangelicals often don't make race visible. But one of the first things I realized when I started reading this literature on evangelical masculinity, how very white their masculine heroes were, and how often, again, they proved their heroism by subduing non-white populations. And I thought that was worth noting. And when I mean very white, I don't just mean men like Teddy Roosevelt and George Patton and Douglas MacArthur and William Wallace. I also mean Confederate generals make the list of heroes as well.
One thing I thought was funny about John Wayne as well was all the divorces and all the the personal life, and yet he was still A hero.
Right. So yes, there's that too, right? So he kind of prefigures. He does a couple of things for me in this book and in the title. He's not just this heroic, white militant masculinity. He also, on screen, he represents this heroic white masculinity, but then off screen, he's also very invested in the rise of the religious right or the conservative republicanism in the 1960s and 1970s. But he's this powerful symbol of secular masculinity, right? He's not evangelical. He's not known for exhibiting traditional Christian virtues. And yet he's seen increasingly over time as this icon of American masculinity, an icon of Christian masculinity. And that's the kind of metaphor here, right? And in that way, he kind of prefigures what we're going to see in the case of evangelical support for somebody like Donald Trump. Very similar dynamics there. He's held up as this masculine ideal precisely because he is not constrained by traditional Christian virtue. And so he is the ultimate fighting champion who will protect Christianity, protect Christian America, and he will do whatever needs to be done.
Yeah, he will do the things that evangelicals can't. And so he becomes
and shouldn't and have not been trained to do, have not been raised to do, right? And so they get labeled wusses. Yeah.
I'm very honored to be a part of this great group, and I'm a huge fan, Kristin. I have been immersed in the Jesus and John Wayne bundle for about about the last 6 months. So I really appreciate being here. You've stated that it was difficult for you to end your book in a manner that demonstrated that you have hope in the future of the evangelical movement. Do you still feel like there's little hope for evangelicalism to be reformed?
Yeah, I did. I've told this story before, but when I was writing the book, I think very early on, I thought, I can change this, right? I'm going to show people what's wrong and they're going to change. And then just a few months in to the research, I abandoned all such hope. I really saw how thoroughly embedded, how deeply embedded these values were, how powerful the institutions and interests behind these values were. And I thought, this is not going to change. It's not. And so I kind of switched my goal, which was just to tell the story. Just tell the story as powerfully as possible to testify. And I was content with that. And that's what I tried to do. So I wasn't wooing readers. I certainly wasn't wooing evangelical readers, as I think you can tell when you read this book, not just the title and subtitle.
Yeah.
I just wanted to tell the story as honestly and powerfully as possible. And that's all. And then I came to the end and we're preparing the manuscript for publication. And my editor emails me. It says, Kristin, this book is really depressing. And he said, you cannot leave your readers here. You cannot leave your readers here. And I was just like, this is what I have. So I took some time. I looked at the narrative. I thought it through and I wrote him back and I said, I'm as depressed as you are. And this is all I can't come up with anything. This is where we are. And it's not great, but this is where we are. And so he said, okay, I respect that. And then a couple of days later, he emails again and was like, Kristin, just give me anything. And that's when I gave him the last sentence of the book. What was once done might also be undone. And I've said this before, but I felt incredibly sheepish setting that. Like he's like, okay, fine, I'll take it. And, but I do believe that I did. There's something about history that is incredibly powerful. And I think particularly for evangelicals, for American evangelicals, because they have controlled their histories. They've controlled their narratives for a long time. They've written their books. They have consumed their own media, right? The media empires, and both Christian and, secular conservative. And so when they are confronted with this history, right, and with these truths and with the darker sides of their histories that they had been ignoring, they were always the hero in the story.
Yeah.
And when they see this, they realize that a couple of things. First of all, things haven't always been the way they are now. conservative Protestants haven't always been militaristic, haven't always embraced this particular construction of militant masculinity. So right there, that frees a lot of people up to ask some really important questions, which is then, how did we get to this point? Who was doing what? What was motivating them? And it frees them to understand that maybe this isn't all God ordained. Maybe this isn't all handed down from on high, right? Traditional gender roles, meaning throughout all of time and history. And I think that's what this history does, is it disrupts these insider stories and forces evangelicals to ask these questions. How did we get here? Now that we see some of these steps, am I cool with this? A lot of people are confronting this. Like the footnotes are here, the quotes are here, and this is not shocking history. The history I write in Jesus and John Wayne is not shocking to historians.
Right.
It's not, right. I'm drawing on the dozens of books written over decades by other historians. Like these narratives are out there. Evangelicals simply have not encountered them before, and when they do, they ask, how did this come to be? Is this where we want to be? And the critical question, how did I not know this before? Right? How did I not know this before? And that helps them to see much more clearly the world they've inhabited. And some ask follow-up questions too, which is, and why was I so comfortable not knowing? And those are just critically important questions. So do I have hope now? I have more hope than when I finished the book, certainly, because I did not think that evangelicals would be the book's biggest fans, and they are. Again, not all, but a much larger swath than I ever anticipated. They are receiving this book with such humility and grappling with such honesty. I have hope there, a lot of hope. A lot of respect. What I don't have a lot of hope for still is that evangelicalism as a movement is going to change, that powerful evangelical institutions are going to change. I'm not seeing that evidence. Instead, I'm seeing individuals change, and individuals try to change their institutions and fail and then walk away. And which is, the Beth Moore narrative, the Russell Moore narrative now. And then, but we see those institutions stay and in some ways become more radicalized because those voices of dissent are no longer there.
Oh my goodness. My heart is pounding. Yes, I'm a big fan of the words disruption and deconstruction. And I think anybody who thinks critically is fans of those words, which means that people who do not think critically are probably running for the hills. So although things may look challenging, if you were asked by some of the primary leaders in the evangelical movement what needs to change, how would you respond?
Yes. So I have been asked that question by different leaders in different contexts, publicly and privately. And and this is where I'm on, I'm a little less confident because I'm a historian and I know my areas of expertise, and that's what happened, not so much like what needs to happen, but I've got some thoughts. For evangelical leaders, and for all evangelicals really, there is a huge need to break down the walls that they have built. Again, this us versus them mentality, this idea that we, as we define ourselves on the inside, whether it's we in Mars Hill Church, we in this particular, definition of orthodoxy, we Lifeway Christian Books, we the SBC, that we have the truth and that the enemy is outside the gates, right? And this it goes hand in hand with militant masculinity, because every man needs a battle to fight, right? That's the essence of obedient Christian masculinity, of being an obedient Christian man. So you got to find your battles, right? Or you got to make your battles. And so really working to bring down those walls, metaphorically, but also, to reach across difference and to understand how evangelicals have created and sustained isolated spaces, and particularly racially, right? But also with respect to other denominations, with respect to other traditions. And the best way to do that is not, what evangelicals have traditionally done, which is invite one or two folks into their communities and then push them back out if they challenge the norms. Instead, it's you go into those other spaces, right? You go into those other spaces and you listen. and maybe you worship, but you listen and you learn. And I think there's very little of that has happened, that is happening. I've been contacted by various white evangelical leaders who are distraught right now, right? They see what they've contributed to. They see what they've been complicit in. They see that for 20, 30, 35 years, they have what they thought was, just serving God and, spreading the gospel was actually doing this. And they want to fix it, right? What can I do? Which is a totally legitimate impulse. But one of the questions I ask is, are you the person to be fixing this? Are you ready to? Do you fully understand what this problem is, right? And to remind evangelicals, in particular, white evangelicals, that the gospel of Christ and the church itself does not depend on evangelicals getting it right. Because evangelicals have for so long considered themselves to be the faithful remnant, right? So much is on their shoulders to keep America faithful, to, keep Christianity pure, to, fill in the blanks, and it's all on them. And it's just really helpful, I think, for white evangelicals to remember that the church is flourishing outside of white evangelical spaces. It always has been outside of American spaces, and to just relax a little bit. And again, maybe you go into those spaces, and maybe this is not your time to lead. And maybe it is, right. Like I can't do that discernment, but these are at least the questions that I want to plant. And so much of that really is just to push people outside of this subculture. And then whether they bring what they learn back in, or whether they stay in those spaces and keep learning, I just don't know. But those are the kinds of conversations that I have with evangelical leaders. That, and then be courageous.
Yes, very important. So if there's a person who's first hearing about these matters, besides reading your book and the bundle, what are the next steps that you recommend?
Connecting to others is so important. And I'll pick up with that, be courageous. That one of the things I discovered through this research was that was most disturbing in some ways. I look at the whole last chapter of the book is on abuse of power, sexual abuse in evangelical organizations and churches. And there are horrific stories of abuse. But as disturbing as the acts of perpetrators, I think, are the patterns that we see repeated over and over again within communities, where we see, quote unquote, good evangelicals, good people, blaming victims, defending perpetrators, covering up abuse to protect the ministry of that man, to protect the witness of the church. And we see these patterns over and over and over again, and it is devastating. And we continue to see it to this day, right? We're just seeing reeling from the latest, the letter that Russell Moore's letter from 2020, and then his updated edition just came out yesterday, kind of revealing these dynamics again within the SBC. And there is so much silence or tacit, right, approval of the abuses that have taken place. And that's one thing that really struck me through this research. And when I think about what needs to be done now, enough of that, right? Enough of that. And that silence has been coerced. And again, getting back to the significance of authority, right? You have to show deference to your authorities, but that's a misplaced deference too often than not. And so that ends up facilitating abusers who are abusing that authority. And then again, so much is done in the name of, protecting the witness of the church. And that's why in the book, I highlight the words of Rachel Denhollander, where she confronts precisely this. And she says, Jesus Christ does not need your protection. Jesus only asks for your obedience. And what that looks like is telling the truth and doing justice. That's all. And I think that if evangelicals, evangelical leaders, ordinary evangelicals, rank and file, if they had just stayed to that, didn't worry about offending friends, offending family, offending their pastor, didn't worry about losing the book deal, didn't worry about losing that place on the platform at the big conference, and just kept telling the truth and pursuing justice, that we would be in an incredibly different place today. So I think all of us, each of us, has to make decisions of when do we speak, how boldly do we speak, and how persistently do we speak, and that we have to start some new patterns.
Great, thank you so much.
Wow, this is a meal right here. It's a lot of stuff we're covering. I can see why you were discouraged after the first few months, but I think through that, prayerfully, if we take these things to heart that are noted in the scriptures and that you've laid out through history, prayerfully, what hasn't been done can be undone. Right now, I just wanted to get a chance to share a few things, just thanking you for dusting off your book and your manuscript and, getting it into book form. And I'll just share very briefly. After me, it'll be Sherry will share, then Douglas, Becky, and then Sheila. And actually, Sheila's going to do like a getting to know you. So she has some few fun questions just to kind of leave things on a little bit of a lighter note, if you will. So I guess I'll just, as I said, I'll just go ahead and start. I think for me, and I said this to you in an email, that I just so much appreciate your voice, your book, and just your speaking. And primarily the thing I'm identifying is courage, because it's a very courageous thing to do what you've done, to write this book. And I know even just looking on Twitter today, there's a lot of backlash that's come to a certain individual, just from different things. And I do think it takes courage to just, stand up and kind of let people know the things that you see that need to change as you see the scriptures. So I appreciate, your courage in that respect. I do think that your book also calls the evangelical church, and really all of us, to deeper faith, because I think the mistake, in my opinion, that the evangelical church has done was, specifically white evangelical, from what you've stated in your book, is to try to control God's narrative instead of just letting God be God. And I think we can all try to fall into that. And I think, just let God be God. He doesn't need a defender. Yeah. He's going to do what he's going to do. And I think your book has showed me, and I think hopefully all of us, where things can go terribly wrong when we try to be God and read ourselves into the scriptures instead of just following the scriptures. Mm-hmm. And the last thing is, I think it's going to cause us to read the Bible more accurately. And kind of to my last point, is not try to twist the scriptures to make it fit what we think it should, but to just flat read it, And Richard T. Hughes has written a book, and he basically asserts that many of us don't know how to read the Bible. Maybe we can quote this or that, or we can, share many different verses we memorize, but do we really know how to read the Bible in a sense that are our lives really conforming to it? And I think your book has really helped us, in that respect. So thank you. Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to the next one that you have, which I think is going to be on the women's side. Is that?
Yes, on a cultural history of white Christian womanhood, covering roughly the same era as Jesus and John Wayne, and that one is called Live, Laugh, Love.
Okay. I'm trying to think of that. That was a lady you had mentioned, but I'll get back to that. Okay. All right, Sherry, take it away.
Live, laugh, love. That's like one of the plaques from the Hobby Lobby things. Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, because you have helped me separate and define many of the strands of this toxic knot of fundamentalism, Christian nationalism, racism, patriarchy, misogyny, and cultural influence verging on idolatry, that I was always aware of, but could not pin what was what, and I couldn't verbalize. And I'm just going to say outright that I had tried to figure out how in the world Trump could have been elected by white evangelicals, and you helped. And I knew that racism was a huge part of that, but I also needed to know the other part of it, and that militant masculinity factor. I was like, of course, this makes perfect sense. So I just wanted to say thank you. Please keep up the good work. Please keep being courageous, and consider me one of your biggest fans.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, Kristin, I'm definitely another fan for lots of reasons. The first one I wanted to mention was what you said about sexual abuse of women and the cover-up. I know that's near the end of the book, but it just seems like a slam dunk. People want power. They won't give up power, even to that point. And this is an issue in every denomination. It's an issue in our denomination. I hate it. Thank you for, you're courageous. Second, I love history. I didn't love history when I did my degree in history, but I have loved it a lot, let's say the last 30 years or so, 40 years. And you connected the dots really well. I'm a baby boomer, and I'm familiar with, like, I don't know, I guess I was familiar with a lot of these things, but they're all in different places, and you brought them together. Thank you for that. And also about militant masculinity. Unless I'm totally misreading church history, the church was pacifist until they got power. In the 4th century, they were very consistently against violence. They were passive resistance, maybe, but definitely it's not what the evangelicals teach. And to me, that's probably my number one beef with the evangelicals. Someone needs to say that. You can't just read Matthew 5 without the Beatitudes and without the last 11 verses of the chapter and say that doesn't apply to us. That's just nuts. If we would just change in that one area, how much more brightly the light of Christ would shine. So you are just fantastic. I'm a fan. Thank you.
You guys are just gonna make me cry here. This is all so kind. Like you said on Twitter, it's a mix, and here everybody's so nice. It's thank you.
You're welcome.
Douglas, I didn't want to cut you off. Was that the end of your comments?
Oh yeah, I have a habit of stopping suddenly. But if I hadn't stopped, I would have said something about crying being a masculine virtue, which many women also exhibit. But yeah, I mean, to say, well, these commands are for men and these commands are for women, that's hardly ever true in the Bible. We can't be selective like that. Okay, now I'm done.
Kristin, I appreciated how validating your book was. It really helped me put the pieces together. I've been studying spiritual abuse for about the past 13 years, and I had a lot of gut senses that I was starting to put together to understand these systems, but you documented them and you proved them. Especially for me, a key point was when you wrote about that odd connection between charismatics and fundamentalists, like specifically fundamentalist homeschoolers. And I had seen that those two groups, like charismatics and then like these fundamentalist homeschoolers, like the Vision Forum, et cetera, are very far apart theologically.
Yes.
They were forming this really odd connection around Christian dominionism, like Seven Mountains dominionism, et cetera. And I was like, I can swear there's a connection there, but you proved it. And I was hollering in my house when I got to that part. I knew it. And my husband was like, what's wrong? I'm like, I knew it. And she just proved it. And that was, for me, that was one of the examples. But you did that many times over, that you put the history together and you documented it. And I think that's so important for those of us trying to do pastoral work in the church and bring healing to the church. Now that we've got the corrupting influences documented, it does help us see how to unravel them. So I appreciated that it was validating and it was so well documented.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so grateful to hear that, really. And, as a historian who spent years trying to track down these footnotes and the evidence, and huge shout out to my 3 research assistants who helped enormously. But yeah, putting the pieces together, it was a lot. And so I'm very grateful to hear that they are being put to such good use.
Well, I have a couple of things. So three big things I think that I got from your book. And the first was professional. I read yours after you read mine, I think. And it was just so wonderful to see, like you mentioned earlier, that you found a lot of the same things in the marriage books, because it just made me feel, okay, I'm really not alone, which was great. And the sexual abuse chapter was just, it was heartbreaking. It was wrenching. There was nothing in there I didn't know already, but it was so wonderful to have it all in one place. And now I can just send people there when they say, you're exaggerating. It's like, no, just go look at this one chapter. So that's just wonderful to have in one place. Then there's As a Canadian. I remember in 1991, I said to my husband, we were in a protracted debate, conflict in our church about the issue of women as elders. And I said, this is also stupid, because there's no way we're going to be fighting about this in 10 years. Like, we all know it's going to be resolved. And that's what we all honestly believed. And if you had told me then that we were going to be going backwards, I would not have believed you. But like, to explain to my girls that it was actually better for women in the church when I was in university than it is for them now in the evangelical church in Canada. And to understand how much of that is because of the American influence, I think helped me figure it out a lot better. And just to see that was, especially the stuff about Billy Graham. I know he wasn't the worst that you mentioned, but to understand a lot more how he coalesced around power was really interesting. So just as a Canadian, that helped. And then just on a personal level, I feel like I've been fighting for 30 years, like to try to change this monster that I'm a part of. And you get depressed because you think, why is it that people who know the Bible so well act it so little? And how can it be that my family members who aren't Christian are nicer and they're kinder? Like, how is that possible? And I think I have an answer now. I don't like the answer. And I'm still struggling with it, but it's good to have an answer. And now we just need to figure out the way forward. But I do appreciate that. So that's been good. Okay. Do you want me to go for the getting to know you questions now, Toma? Okay. So these are some fun ones. Are you ready? So we're going to do a lightning round. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, Kristin. This is just for Kristin, right? Toma, you don't want everybody?
Yes. That's
That's
for
Kristin. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So, favorite cuisine?
Does takeout count as a cuisine? Because that's what it comes to. So in order, probably Thai, Indian, and Chinese is what we do around here lately.
Amen. Okay. What's your favorite film or miniseries or anything?
Ooh, so I'm terrible. I don't actually watch a ton, and what I do watch is with my kids. Fortunately, they're a little bit older now, so enhanced quality. But I think my favorite viewing experience has been watching the entire Buffy series with my middle child, with my daughter. And we started the first night of the lockdown last March. And that was our companion through at least the first half of the pandemic. And it was just great bonding, great sex ed. We could talk about consent. We can talk about all kinds of things. And so Buffy became our thing. So that's close to my heart still.
That's great. What's your morning routine?
Oh my gosh, it's just getting up, getting 3 kids up, breakfast and to school is my morning routine, and grabbing a cup of coffee somehow in that mix, and then sitting down right here at my computer and starting to email and seeing what writing deadlines I have. And if it's not a teaching day, but it really is, and there's nothing lovely about it at all. It really is getting 3 kids out of the house on time to school.
Yep. Paper Bible or digital Bible?
Paper. I mean, I shouldn't say that because I'm always looking at Bible verses and for my research, I've always done it. Then it's online, but to actually sit and read paper.
Yep. Favorite book of the Bible right now?
This is tough. I think I'll say Ephesians. I just always kind of come back to Ephesians. I just love thinking, being centered in Christ. And again, how unexpected and how countercultural and kind of the heart of the gospel, and that being the touchstone. And you go out from there.
Right. and can do more than we can ask or imagine. And I think that's what we're seeing this year. So, okay. Favorite Bible character. And it has to.
Wait, you broke up a little bit. So favorite Bible character, and it has to be what?
Jail. I feel like
it has to be
jail.
Yeah.
Or however you say her
that's
name.
a given, right? That's going to be a given. So I really am always fascinated with the Canaan, the woman from Canaan, right? Who asked Jesus for healing, and he's like, this isn't for you. This isn't for you. And instead of just scuttling away, she comes back and says, right, even the dogs around the master's table get the crumbs, and he's like, okay, fine. I just love that, right? Because I don't know what to make of Jesus in that story, but I love the woman from Canaan, that she was just going to stick with it. Yeah, whether she's offended or not, this is going to make the difference. She's going to get what she needs from Jesus. And so I love that story.
Right. Outside of the Bible, what is your favorite book or author?
Oh, let me think. I'm a bad person with favorites, like all-time favorites. I don't know, maybe it's a historian thing. It's like, really, I have to choose one. One author I really admire, and when I read his work, I'm kind of blown away, is Tim Tyson, Blood Dents on My Name. I just assigned that in class again, and just gorgeous writing. It's historical. He brings in some of his own narrative as a white Southerner. It talks about race and justice and religion, and in just incredibly nuanced ways. And he is a remarkable writer. So that's one that when I read that, I think, wow, I'd like to do this somehow. I don't think I can do this, but it's the writing that inspires me for all those reasons. It's the moral center, the historical research, and the gorgeous writing.
Right. So would you be Jane Austen or Jane Eyre? Whose team would you be on?
Oh my gosh. Like this is going to sound like such a cop out, but like both, but it's been a long time. It's been a long time since I'm terrible with reading fiction. I will confess that. I think that's, like everybody says, like, you need to be well-grounded as a scholar and read fiction, and it improves your writing and all that stuff. The fiction that I read is what I read aloud to my 8-year-old every night. So right now we're in the land of stories, and, we did Harry Potter, and that's my fiction. That's my fiction. So I don't know if that counts.
Yeah. What's your favorite place to live?
Oh, you forgot the other one. The book that we should read the next 12 months.
Oh, did I? Oh, okay. Well, I thought that was sort of Tim Tyson. What book do you think everyone should read the next 12 months?
Okay, the next 12 months. So I'm going to do a new one that people haven't heard about, because I have too many friends who have books out right now. So the book that's going to come out in the next 12 months is Dante Stewart's Shoutin' in the Fire. And it's going to be out in the fall, I think. And it is, I've read parts of it. It is amazing, powerful voice addressing the American Christian church right now. Gorgeously written. And again, that just powerful moral center. So Dante Stewart's book, look for it this fall.
Awesome. Where's your favorite place to live?
Imaginary, or where I actually have lived? Because I like to imagine living somewhere on the coast, a rocky coast, not tropical, so kind of Maine, maybe Nova Scotia, or maybe in the British Isles, that kind of thing. That's what I would like in my imagination.
And where would you most want to visit?
So I've had this thing for a while, probably because I really like IKEA, but I wanted to experience midsummer in Sweden. I think that would be a really fun vacation, eat the foods and relax, do whatever they do. I don't know. That's this kind of romanticized notion. So that's one of the kind of, when we, during this pandemic, and my daughter and I would kind of dream up, where do we want to go? What do we want to do when this is all over? That was always on our list.
I've been to Sweden in midsummer. It was quite nice.
I hope so, because it's disappointing if it's not. That's that's our plan.
Are you team Apple or team Android?
So I'm team, do I really have to update my technology? And my husband is absolutely. And so I am team Apple because my husband is, and he forces me
Right.
to upgrade. Otherwise, I would probably still have the flip phone. But
Right.
team Apple, such as it is. Yes.
And what's one of your favorite apps on your phone?
Oh my gosh. Let's see. Apps.
Twitter.
Oh my God. Yeah, that counts. Like, I don't even think of it as an app. That's kind of an extension of me. Yes, Twitter.
I know.
Obviously, Twitter. Twitter is where
I think of it as work. I think of Twitter as work, so I have to turn it off when I'm not at work. Yeah.
No, I love it. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't think of it as work. Maybe I could convince my employer it is, and I should get compensated for it. But I think they would feel more comfortable if I'd stay off of Twitter, actually. But no, when people even say, this website, I'm like, what website you're talking about? Oh, that's right. Twitter's a website. It does feel very much like just an extension. And it really, this last year, it has been, as my social world, actual social world essentially disappeared. I used to have coffee every day with colleagues at work. They're good friends. And then we all went into isolation and we're just, everything is mediated through screens. I see what happened. And I kind of took that social energy and found great peers and conversation partners on Twitter. And, I really cherish those relationships. And I mean, many of you I know from Twitter. And I absolutely love it. I love it. And, it gets a bad rap for good reason. And at the same time, it's a really fun space to be. So Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like on Twitter, I'm changing the world. On Facebook, I'm all nice, and on Instagram, I'm all pretty. And it's all like you're all different things on each platform.
I'm so terrible with Instagram. I can't do. I mean, I'm on Instagram. You can find me there. You can see like literally my bio is bad at Instagram. I just can't do it. Like I try, but Twitter is my space, and Facebook too. I'm nicer on Facebook. I think it's fair to say.
Becky's really good. Becky is really good at Instagram. She can give you some pointers.
Yes, I will. I have much to learn. I actually asked my student researchers this summer working with me on Live, Laugh, Love, and Instagram is the place to be for that. And they are on Instagram. They're younger, and so I've assigned them. They need to tutor me this summer and teach me how to do Instagram. So that's their challenge.
I would love to see you master TikTok.
I really think that TikTok should be reserved for the younger generation. My students keep trying to get me over there too. And I think, am I old enough to say I think I'm too old for that? But I don't know. TikTok, it's where the kids are. So I appreciate people who represent Jesus and John Wayne on TikTok. Sometimes that's shared on my Twitter with me. And I just, thank you for that, because you are in spaces where I don't know that I can be. So thank you.
Well, again, thank you so much for your book. I'm not sure how much negative press you've received, or just the challenges you've gone through. I'm sure there's been obviously, hopefully great conversations that you've had. And we just wanted to kind of reaffirm that today, and just, kind of in a sense, lift up your hands to keep going and keep fighting and keep being courageous and not backing down, and continuing to write just, great books that really challenge us to look at the scriptures afresh, to really make sure we're depending on God and not making stuff up just to, perpetuate whatever we want to do, in our theology. So thank you for that. We are going to go ahead and wrap it up right now. Thank you for all the co-hosts for taking time out of your day to join us. We do have my good friend here, Kyle, who says, this is awesome. So hopefully you can get a chance to get a hold of him, Becky. He is just an awesome brother. You guys can maybe get a chance to chat. But again, thanks so much for your time. Those of you that found value in this episode, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell notifications, and look out for more great content. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you all so much.